Once again, the issue of how do we prevent firearms-related violence is in the headlines in Canadian media. And this week, it's in relation to legislation that's been introduced in New Zealand. Now, before I get into that issue, I want to start by saying the Christchurch Mosque Massacre was a terrorist act that should be resoundingly condemned by the entire international community. What happened there was an act of pure hatred and violence, and of course we should be working together to prevent violent acts like that from occurring anywhere around the world, and certainly Canada has not been immune to attacks like that on our soil as well. So now we're faced with a question on how we prevent firearms-related violence. And one of the headlines that I just saw was that it's a CBC article, and it said that Ottawa is under pressure to have more significant and more strict firearms-related legislation in Canada in relation to what happened in New Zealand. So let's talk about that, because in the article that I just read, the people that were quoted were people that were, very strongly associated with anti-firearms related groups. So as a legislator, I share a concern, I think, and I hope everybody would have this concern, that we want to prevent firearms related violence. I mean, if you're watching this feed and that's something that you don't want to do, we're probably not going to have a lot in common. I want to make sure that firearms-related violence in Canada does not occur. The reality is that out of all violent crimes in Canada, and this is according to Statistics Canada, the amount of violent crime that is perpetrated with a firearm in our country, in Canada, is about 3%. That number should be 0. But it's 3%. So we need to start from that particular fact. How much is actually caused by a firearm? And then we start moving into, where do those firearms come from? So if you do a little bit of a search in Canada, you'll find that most firearms related violence, that 3% of all violent crime in Canada is firearms related. And of that 3%, a majority of firearms related violence in Canada is committed with firearms that were illegally obtained, many of which were smuggled in from the United States. So if you start saying that what other countries are doing should be imported into the Canadian context, you're ignoring the fact that you're ignoring two big factors. First of all, Canada is not the United States, and Canada is not another country, in that Canada already has some of the strictest firearms laws in the world. You've heard me say this many times on this particular feed. I am a firearms owner. It took me a very long time to become certified. You have to go through very rigorous training and certification processes, screening processes, and then I am subject to very strict rules around where I can use those firearms, under what circumstances, how I can transport them and store them. We have very strict laws that are much stricter and much more restrictive than other countries, especially the United States. The other thing that you have to consider is that Canada shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, and many of the firearms that are used in violent crime in Canada are illegally imported from that country. So if we're looking at legislation and the goal is to affect public safety and to prevent firearms-related violence, we already have really strict laws by which people have to abide by in order to legally own a firearm in Canada. And most of the firearms violence in Canada comes from firearms that are illegally sourced. Then will legislation that puts more restrictions on law-abiding firearms owners prevent firearms-related crime? And that's the question that is curiously absent in most of the conversations on firearms legislation in Canada, because nobody that is sort of arguing on the other side wants to look at that particular piece of data. To me, the bigger question that we have to address in Canada on this issue is how we prevent illegal firearms from being smuggled into the country and then being used in gang-related crime, which is where most of this happens from. So to me, I mean, I am very happy to, as a firearms owner, to abide by the law in this country. I'm more than happy to do that. However, when you look at myself and people like me in this community, that's not where these firearms are coming from. So if you put more restrictions without any data, for example, let's say there's something called an authorization to transport. There's current legislation in front of the House of Commons right now that would change that, but there's no data showing that that particular issue was at the cause of firearms-related violence in Canada. Then are we actually doing anything to keep the country safe? And my answer to that is no. In this parliament, over the last few years, we've seen Justin Trudeau's government put forward omnibus justice legislation that actually watered down the penalties for gang-related crime, did nothing to address the issue of preventing gang violence. I could go on and on. So instead of addressing some of the issues where these firearms are coming from, these crime-related firearms, they're looking at the easier target, which is people that are already highly regulated and you know, hey, as it should be. But there's no data to show that that's going to materially reduce the incident of firearms-related violence in Canada. So going back to this issue today in the news about the legislation that's coming out of New Zealand, I'm just going to point it out. New Zealand does not share a border with the United States. New Zealand does not have the same legislative framework that Canada already does in terms of our firearms restrictions. So I think we need to be very careful in importing any comparisons between these two countries because of headlines that are in the news. We have to maintain our own sovereignty in Canada, and in working towards that objective of reducing firearms-related violence, we have to make sure that our laws and our legislative framework respect the rights of people that are already highly regulated and also actually reduces firearms-related violence. You've heard me talk a long time, many times about this issue, but I look at things like in Alberta has not had a lot of justices or judges appointed, and we have a backlog in our courts to the point where somebody who was accused of murder with a firearm and gang-related violence actually walked free because they termed out under something called the Jordan application. That's a problem that Justin Trudeau's government needed to deal with. And similarly, I don't understand why we wouldn't be looking at tougher penalties for people who smuggle in firearms from the United States, or trying to tighten up screening or prevention of that particular activity, or stronger penalties for that. In fact, my party leader, Andrew Scheer, has laid out our Conservative platform on this issue. You can see it on the Conservative Party website, and it undertakes specific measures to address gang-related violence and the importation of illegal firearms, because we know that that is where the issue is coming from. So I just hope that many of you who might not be up to speed on this particular issue, when you see these headlines, you ask yourself if this is the actual right way to address this issue in Canada, or if perhaps we need to resist the temptation to escalate a Canadian issue in response to another country's legislation that does not have the same context as we do. Now, there are similarities, of course, but the key similarity that I want to point out is the need for us to prevent these crimes. In order to do that, we have to make sure that we're addressing legislation in Canada based on the facts and the data that we have here. And the data overwhelmingly shows that the problem can't be addressed with bills like Bill C-71. This is the anti-firearms legislation that the Liberals have introduced, which does nothing to address gang-related crimes. And this is why I tabled a petition in the House of Commons a couple of weeks ago. It was kind of lost in all of the noise in the SNC-Lavalin scandal, but tens of thousands of people in Canada oppose Bill C-71. They oppose Bill C-71 and want it scrapped for this reason. So look at the facts and also ask, if our goal is to prevent this type of violence, what's the best way to do it in Canada? And I don't think Bill C-71 or any of the issues that have been raised in the headlines in the last couple of days here in the Canadian media without any sort of counterpoint to that is the best way to do that. I'm going to keep fighting for legislation that actually protects people, that puts stronger penalties on those who would seek to skirt our law in Canada related to firearms, and actually address some of these issues rather than bringing up a debate that is very American in style and is not in the correct context for Canada. Working hard for you. Have a great day.